Good evening, everyone. It is just a few minutes before 7 o'clock. I want to spend those few minutes, we want everyone to have a good, fair chance of being here for the beginning of the program, and I don't want to take away time from it. So what I propose to do is some simple welcomes and some simple prayers. I don't think the welcomes will surprise you. I hope the prayers will. I'm told that we have, representing First Baptist Church, Brenda and Jim Schwall, and Ruth Robinson is front and center. Thank you. David and Claire Hawley from First Centenary. Yes, are here. Good. Yes, sir. Thank you. David Cooper from First Pres. Perfect. And Geraldine Charlton from St. Peter and St. Paul. Someone was looking yesterday here for flying buttresses, and I said, well, you're not going to find any here. He said, is there any other chance? And I said, well, I don't know exactly what you're looking for, but why don't you try St. Peter and St. Paul? That's a better chance than here. Sam Quattrochi is here with Cumberland Pres, is that right? He will be here. We expect that he'll walk in the door. And in a few moments, someone introduced Jim Frierson, who is most of you, and then he will do further introductions. The prayer that I would like to offer, the surprise I have for you is that I'm an Episcopalian and I'm going to pray extemporaneously. But then you will not be surprised that I will ask that we also offer a prayer that is, in fact, written in a book. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let's pray. Holy God, we give you thanks that you are with us this evening as you were with your first disciples and are in every age. We thank you that you call us to unity after times of strife, to peace after warfare, to your kingdom, and to participating in the coming of your kingdom on earth. For those who gather here this evening, those who teach, those who learn, for the food we have enjoyed here or in our homes or elsewhere, for the nourishment you give us in Scripture, in sacrament, in fellowship, in sharing faith together. All this we offer to you in thanksgiving and prayer and praise. In the name of Christ Jesus, our Lord. Amen. You would be disappointed if we didn't engage in prayer from a book. Would you join with me in the prayer our Lord Jesus teaches us? There will be slight variations in the text according to denomination. The Lord God hears them all. Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you all again for being here, and a special thanks to Jim Frierson for bringing us together, people of intellect and faith and curiosity and imagination, and also to John Payne and Bill Eisenstein and others on our Adult Education Committee here. We hope that those of you who have not been here lately or not been here before will find this an occasion of invitation to be with us again. And we look forward to being with you in opportunities of faith and ministry. Thank you. Jim, thank you very much. Applaud you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Anyone who loves history knows that it takes only just a little bit of a nudge to do what you sometimes have been thinking about doing for years. In the case of this program, I know that for the last years I've been on walking tours with Jim Ogden, with Chris Young, and other interpretive historians of Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. I'm always thinking that several of us are crazy enough to be interested in battlefields and the tactics of what happens in the course of something as epic as the Civil War. But I think there's an even broader group of people who can identify with churches, with homes, with farms, and with the city of Chattanooga. You don't have to have gone to West Point to understand the significance of a shell coming through the wall of your church, or having the stones of your church dismantled just as the church was nearly complete. Or the pews in your church becoming a hospital, or this room becoming an arsenal, an armory, and under the control of two warring forces in your own country. It is hard for us to conceive of that, but it takes the talents of interpretive historians who know their facts, who are committed to telling the story. So, for a year I kicked this idea around, but in about August, standing up on Stringer's Ridge with Jim Ogden, I said, I'm speaking under no authority whatsoever from our church, but I think there would be curiosity in doing a program, an adult ed-like program, either on a Sunday or on a Wednesday night. And Bill Eiselstein, to his credit, said, let's do it on a Wednesday night when we're not pressured by having a service following it. Let's do justice to this program, and that's why we're here. So thank you for all that, early encouragement from our rector, from our adult ed committee, and from our vestry. The glory of living in Chattanooga and being with someone like Jim Ogden, for me, was reflected not long after I'd been here. An alumni college came through town with James McPherson, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, who had been one of my advisors. I was a history major in college, and I had been with Jim on tours, and I thought, well, now I really have the chance to have the eminent authority, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, explain the significance of these battles that I think I already know something about. And as we're standing at Chickamauga on a beautiful day, McPherson opens it up and he says, this is a moment I know you've all waited for, and now I'd like to turn the whole thing over to the person who really knows that story, Jim Ogden. I had my video camera trained on McPherson, and immediately I did a pivot, and for the next hour, I'm trained on Jim Ogden. I've described him as a one-man reenactment. I've seen him take groups larger than this and divide them into South Carolina and Ohio regiments and literally have them marching up Snodgrass Hill and opposing each other. That is a certain gift. Jim comes from a very historic part of southern Maryland, but from every account, he's known from an early age and from his own family that the Civil War was something he wanted to pursue with a laser-like focus, and he has done exactly that. He's served at Harper's Ferry, he's served in other national parks, but since the not 1880s, 1980s, he's been our...
It feels like it.
And then when the federal government had its momentary lapse here and its shutdown, I went into another panic mode because we'd announced this event, and I thought, uh-oh. But once again, Ogden was ahead of the curve. He had told me very pointedly, I'm going to be doing this in my off time. This will be an evening event. And he put a lot of emphasis on that. I thought, I didn't understand in August and September why he was saying all that. But when the federal government...
it was not because I knew there was going to be a shutdown.
But he told me not to worry, and then he reconfirmed that, so I knew I didn't have to. Our park continues to grow, of course, with the expansion with Moxon Bend becoming part of that unit. Shelley Andrews of our own parish is the director of Friends of Moxon Bend. We have people here tonight from not only that Friends group, but from Friends of Chickamauga and Chattanooga. It's no surprise to me that all you have to do is put the word out on something like this, and all of you come from other churches and other parts of the community. So thanks for those who've already sent material. I've asked each representative of the church to have a little something to say when Jim finishes. So almost in lieu of Q&A, if you would give each of them an opportunity for a little bit of show and tell. There's some really great stories that I'd never heard before. My friend, the historian of Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Jim Ogden.
Thank you, Jim. And I wander around a little bit, as many of you all know, as I speak. Most of you all probably also know that I'm full of hot air, so I won't have to necessarily, I think, stick close to the microphone. I should be able to speak loudly enough for everybody in the room. And I told Jim that day up on Stringer's Ridge, I'd be more than happy to do a program along this line, and we were able to eventually work it out. In a lot of ways, I'm going to do some context, the big picture kind of thing, because with the representatives of all the other churches here, why should I sit up here and try to learn something about each one of the individual churches? Let Ruth handle the Baptist church and others their respective churches. So I'm going to mostly look kind of at the big picture. And as all of you all, I'm sure, are aware, over the last couple of years, we have been doing events recognizing the 150th anniversary of our nation's terrible, tragic, yet transformative Civil War. I've been doing that as part of my day job at Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park, but I've also done programs for the Chattanooga History Center and the Chattanooga Civil War Roundtable. In March of 2012, I did a program here at St. Paul's on a Sunday morning, looking at an earlier aspect of St. Paul's role in Civil War history. And I've been trying to cover more than just the battles themselves, kind of as Jim noted. And indeed, this day, the 23rd day of October, is a great day to be doing this program. And I'm going to see if I can get a little bit of audience participation right now. Why is this day so good a day to be doing this program? In Chattanooga Civil War history, what is the 23rd day of October? Does anyone know?
The day Grant came to
It's the day Ulysses S. Grant arrives in Chattanooga, the newly promoted commander of the just created Military Division of the Mississippi, that overall geographic command that Abraham Lincoln has created that stretches from the Appalachian Mountains westward to the Mississippi River to coordinate the actions of Union armies within that area. Ulysses S. Grant had been directed to come to Chattanooga to redeem the situation here as a result of the defeat of the Union Army of the Cumberland at Chickamauga, and that army having become cooped up in a 1 square mile area here in the bend of the Tennessee River. And Grant had made his way from Vicksburg, Mississippi. He went all the way to Indianapolis, Indiana, and then to Louisville, and then by rail from Louisville to Nashville to Stevenson to Bridgeport, Alabama. And if you find Mickey Robbins' article in the Chattanooga History Journal, you can read about the Anderson Road coming over Walden's Ridge. And it's along that tenuous supply route that Ulysses S. Grant, still injured from the fall that he had suffered from his horse in New Orleans in September, Ulysses S. Grant spent 2 days riding the 60 to 70 miles through the wet and the mud over Walden's Ridge, and late on the 23rd of October, he will ride off the brow down through the Civil War version of the W, which was in the same place, just in a different form, and then come down the Anderson Turnpike, down a road even steeper than the W road is today, and then ride the last distance and cross the pontoon bridge over the Tennessee River and into Chattanooga. And somewhere on the last part of that trip, his horse will slip and lose its footing and will throw Grant to the ground yet again. But he will ride into town, wet, cold, and he will immediately go to the headquarters of his subordinate, the commander of the Union troops here in Chattanooga, George Henry Thomas, the Virginian who had remained loyal to the United States, and to learn what the plans are, the greater details for a plan to open a new supply line into Chattanooga. And depending upon whether you're a Grant fan or a Thomas fan, You can describe that meeting in the Richardson House in the 300 block of Walnut Street as more or less frosty, or maybe at least cool, wet, and damp. Certainly some of Grant's staff officers would later say they were offended that no dry clothes were offered Grant when he first arrived. But the professional soldier, George Thomas, wanted to get right down to business with his new boss, Ulysses S. Grant. And that meeting will lead in 4 days to important events that turn the tide here at Chattanooga, the opening of the Cracker Line. So as we sit here this evening thinking about these events of the fall mostly of 1863, remember on this day, probably when it was even darker than it is outside already, coming down Walden's Ridge and into Chattanooga is a man who's going to be very responsible in turning the tide here at Chattanooga. Now, when Grant rode into Chattanooga, he rode into a very important place. Now, many of us are familiar with this image of Chattanooga, looking north along Market Street from roughly the area of Market and 11th. There, the Western Atlantic Freight Depot building. Oops, there it is. The Western Atlantic Freight Depot building right there. Now the EPB building stands on that site. And in many ways, this picture serves to be representative of Civil War Chattanooga. It appears so frequently in publications of that or for that purpose. You can also see the steeple of the Presbyterian Church there along Market Street at 7th. But as I said, in that fall of 1863, the eyes of two nations were focused on the events that were unfolding here. Just a few days before, on October the 4th, senior Confederate generals had authored a petition to their president seeking a change in command of the Army because they realized how important Chattanooga was. And in part, that petition says, "It is needless to enlarge upon the importance of possession of Chattanooga. To us, it is the gateway of supplies for a Confederate army in Tennessee. To the enemy, it is a formidable tete-de-pont from which his armies can debouch into the heart of the Confederacy." That same day, United States President Abraham Lincoln sent to his then commander in Chattanooga, William Stark Rosecrans, who Rosecrans didn't know it, but he had 15 days at that time to be in command of this army. But Lincoln sent to Rosecrans a message to encourage Rosecrans to hold on to Chattanooga. If we can hold Chattanooga and East Tennessee, I think the rebellion must dwindle and die. I think you and Burnside can do this, and hence doing so is your main object. Of course, to greatly damage or destroy the enemy in your front would be a greater object, because it would include the former and more. And even soldiers who were on their way to participate in this campaign recognized how important it was. This Indianan would write to his wife, "It is the grandest military movement of the war. This massing of troops on the center. Like movements on a chessboard, everything else has become subordinate to this grand attack on the enemy's center at Chattanooga, which is in reality the key to the whole position. When I say whole position, I mean the whole line of our contending armies as they stretch from the Potomac to Texas, and so consider the present movement of our army towards the center of such a line is the grandest military movement of any age. If we are in time, we shall be able to overwhelm the rebel forces in our front, and from Chattanooga, we are in position to knock loudly at the back doors of Charleston and Richmond. I feel the natural ardor of a soldier and a patriot in such a momentous undertaking, and all merely personal things are for the moment lost sight of." The eyes of two nations were focused here. Now, what is interesting about this picture is what you notice very little of in the streets. People. But in the fall of 1863, Chattanooga was a militantly crowded and busy place. The artist Theodore Davis, having just arrived in Chattanooga, would pen a sketch from the top of the rise where essentially Warehouse Row and the City Hall and other buildings stand today. Chattanooga was then the position of the Union Army of the Cumberland. While the infantry and artillery ringed the city, the streets were crowded with staff officers and support troops performing their duties, and wagons of supplies. Even though Confederate possession of Lookout Mountain and the circuitous route over the imposing and rugged Walden's Ridge back to Bridgeport and Stevenson, the route that Grant had experienced, significantly reduced the number of wagons that reached the city to deliver their contents to the troops, and such storage places as the railroad depot, the car shed, the Union Depot here, and the Western Atlantic Freight Depot. This reduced number of wagons that daily rumbled into and out of town were still a great number, even if Union rations had to be reduced from a full ration of roughly 3 pounds a day to a quarter ration as the days of October wore on. But as Chattanooga's streets saw all of this activity, they also took on a new character. Because while they didn't know it, although by the 23rd of October they probably sensed it, when it began to rain late on September the 30th, the year-long drought that had beset the southeast was broken. And now, as it rained in October, the thousands of feet and hooves and wagon wheels that had raised dust back in September and August now browned the dirt streets of Chattanooga into a grid of quagmires that challenged both men and beast as they struggled along and across the streets of Chattanooga. Chattanooga was well on its way to presenting the appearance that an observer in just another month's time would have of Chattanooga. Chattanooga was formerly a town of about 4,000 inhabitants, containing some fine public buildings and many pleasant residences, with ornamented grounds and groves of beautiful trees. But it is now terribly desecrated and defaced. Fences of all enclosure gone, fruit and ornamental trees alike cut down for firewood, all vacant spaces covered with huts and tents, and the more prominent points crowned with strong fortifications, the whole surrounded by rifle pits and lines of circumvallation. And caught up in this position of the Union Army of the Cumberland were Chattanooga's churches. This map, produced in late 1863 by Union Army engineers, is an excellent representation of Chattanooga at the time. And I've got a paper copy I can lay out on the table afterwards for those of you all who might want to look at it more closely. But on the map, there is wartime St. Paul's along Chestnut, just on the south side of 8th Street. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church next door to it, along Chestnut. The Catholic Church over along what would become Lindsay. The Baptist Church up on the lot, the northern part of the lot where the courthouse stands today. The Methodist Church. Notice how close it is there to the line of Union fortifications that has been constructed. And then along Market Street at 7th is the Presbyterian Church. But even before the main real important campaign for Chattanooga had begun in 1863, Chattanooga and its churches had felt the hard hand of war. As a result of the federal seizure of the Tennessee and Cumberland River forts of Henry and Donaldson in February of 1862 by the subsequently nicknamed Unconditional Surrender Grant, Chattanooga had become a more important place. On this map, the initial Confederate defensive line is what is dotted there out of southern Missouri along Kentucky-Tennessee border and up into to western Virginia and northern Virginia. But when Grant's troops penetrated this line along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers in February of 1862, it will result in the Confederates losing much of middle and west Tennessee, including the capital of the volunteer state. And as Nashville was evacuated, there was a flood of refugees and equipment and others coming south out of Nashville along the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, and their first real stop along that route was Chattanooga. Coming into town under the cover and the protection of the Union Depot or the car shed, and arriving essentially unannounced in a to a largely unsuspecting and hence unprepared town of Chattanooga. The car shed shown on the map here is Union Depot. They're in the block just south of 11th Street, just blocked south of 9th Street or MLK today. And perhaps most importantly, or critically, amongst those passengers flooding into Chattanooga were hundreds, maybe several thousand of sick Southern soldiers evacuated from the fledgling Confederate hospitals in Nashville. They arrived in need of care, and the citizens and few Confederate officials then in town turned to try to provide for their needs. Soldiers were taken into private homes, and impromptu hospitals were established in the churches, like the wartime version of St. Paul's, and in hotels such as the Central House on Market Street and the Crutchfield House there along Broad Street in the block where today the Reed House stands. And while these impromptu efforts helped a great deal, there still needed to be more order and system. And in late March, Confederate authorities sent to Chattanooga a physician who proved to have great administrative capabilities, Dr. Samuel H. Stout of Pulaski, Giles County, Tennessee. And Stout quickly establishes some structure and order, moving soldier patients out of homes and less appropriate facilities and into more centralized locations. This wartime view of Chattanooga in very late 1863 or early 1864. In this view, you're looking from the northeast towards the southwest across the southern portion of town. And on it you can find St. Paul's, the Crutchfield House, the Union Depot or car shed, the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian Church, and there overlooking all of it is Lookout Mountain. Stout quickly established more formal hospitals at a number of locations, including the Masonic Academy on the southern shoulder of Cameron Hill, and at other select locations, including the upper stories of some of the commercial buildings along Market Street. But most significantly, towards making Chattanooga the hospital center it became for just over a year for the Confederacy, was Stout's construction of a regular hospital complex. The buildings that you see along the southern shoulder of Cameron Hill, or what will often or sometimes take the name of College Hill. You can see the structures there, and in this view, they appear a little more closely. A series of 1- and 2-story buildings, each floor holding about 50 patients, and built on some of the most advanced and current ideas about health. They were well-ventilated structures to allow for good air exchange. And as Stout provided order to the medical situation here in Chattanooga, his administrative abilities were recognized, and soon he was given command of Confederate hospitals in Cleveland, Ringgold, Dalton, Kingston, and Atlanta, a growing system of essentially self-contained hospitals each with a name, with a set of equipment and personnel, almost like the MASH hospital of the old television show. And Stout's system began to provide the care that was necessary to sick and injured soldiers in the Confederate Army of Tennessee. And his system of potentially movable hospitals would be tested in July and August of 1863 when Braxton Bragg's army fell back on Chattanooga from Middle Tennessee, and Chattanooga itself became part of the front line of the Confederate war for independence. And when William Stark Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland advanced in the 3rd week of August, Chattanooga, learning of that advance, went on the 21st of August, a day of fasting, prayer, and thanksgiving in the Confederate States of America. The pharmacist and cannon commander Eli Lilly sent some iron and lead pills that day into Chattanooga. And as Jim intimated, some of those shells literally rattled the walls of some of the church buildings as those in town that day attended fast day services. At St. Paul's, the Episcopal chaplain Charles Todd Quintard, chaplain of the 1st Tennessee Infantry, was preaching at the time. And in the Presbyterian Church on Market Street, Thomas Hook Macaulay had arranged for one of the most preeminent reverends of the Confederate States of America, Benjamin Morgan Palmer, to be speaking. And of course it is the prayer by Palmer that is so famously interrupted by some of these shells, and you get the varying stories about whether or not there was anyone left in the congregation when Palmer finished the long prayer. And it is said that he had his eyes closed, so he must not have been reading from the Book of Common Prayer. Given the system, and Stout's system now is really tested, and he is forced to relocate his Chattanooga hospital establishment southward, sending the patients, staff, furniture, and equipment to new locations in Georgia. And given the difficulty he'd had in obtaining material to construct the hospital buildings here, Stout even contemplated having the buildings disassembled and the material shipped southward to be used in the construction of new facilities. In the end, Bragg was forced to abandon Chattanooga on September the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and about all the salvage Stout seems to have been able to accomplish was to take the windows and doors from the complex that he had built on the southern shoulder of Cameron Hill. The Union Army will occupy Chattanooga on September the 9th. The Union regimental flag from the 97th Ohio being raised on fortifications on Cameron Hill, and very quickly the Union Army began to turn Chattanooga into a Union post. A garrison is established. A brigade of mostly Indiana soldiers under George Wagner is assigned that duty. Quartermaster, commissary, ordnance officers, and detachments of those personnel begin to arrive and begin to turn Chattanooga into a Union supply base. There are hundreds of wagons grinding the dirt streets into a fine powdery dust that their passage beats into the air to then settle on everything. The diminished quantity of rain in the last year and the last weeks telling visibly as all that movement occurs along the streets. Engineers arrive, and the Confederate fortifications in certain parts of town begin to be reconstructed into Union fortifications. And since the Tennessee River then had no bridge across it, and the likelihood of having to move large quantities of material across the river exceeded the potential capacity of the ferry boat, the engineers turned to begin the construction of the first bridges across the Tennessee River. Trestle bridges. After having sounded the Tennessee River on a line, they then build giant sawhorses, depending on their height, depending upon the depth of the river. And they then anchor the sawhorses in the river side by side to one another and then plank the top over. Now, this is an expedient bridge, and it works. And they'll eventually build 2 of them like this across the river. But how well is a bridge like that going to do if the river rises? Now, also begin the process of building the boats necessary for a floating military bridge. Medical personnel arrive. One in particular, Surgeon Israel Moses, is sent here with orders to prepare beds for 3,000 wounded, since it was likely that there would be a clash near Chattanooga. He finds supplies in town for about 1,000 injured soldiers. He finds also that the abandoned Confederate hospital complex is capable of holding about 500, but it is already occupied by about 150 sick Union soldiers. He notes that the buildings were without doors or windows and destitute of every convenience. He does find secreted in Chattanooga, and which he takes control of and has guarded, 200 bales of cotton to be used to fill bed sacks for the anticipated wounded. And later on, when this need becomes real, they actually turn to the citizen soldiers in the ranks. We can still have this very experience today amongst our soldiers in combat in Afghanistan, since we have so many National Guardsmen involved. These men who fought these Civil War battles came from the civilian realm. And what skills did they bring with them? Whatever their occupation was at home. And guess what they eventually find amongst the Union soldiers? There are upholsterers and tailors and harness makers. And guess what their skills easily translate to? Sewing that cotton and those bed sacks into mattresses for the wounded. Moses begins to identify other buildings that could be converted to hospital use as well. And coming into Chattanooga at this time are representatives from 2 other organizations supporting the Union war effort. The United States Sanitary Commission, an organization that believed that health could be achieved by proper sanitation. Remember, this is an era before germs and disease are fully understood. But there is the recognition that those who live cleaner are generally more healthful. And so the Sanitary Commission has been pushing the Army to essentially fulfill or meet its own regulations about sanitary conditions in camp. And also coming into town are representatives of the Christian Commission, an offshoot of the Young Men's Christian Association. And their principal aim is to minister to the spiritual needs of the soldiers, but this will translate quickly to medical as well. And the Christian Commission is given the Baptist Church for their use. The new owners of Chattanooga also strive to establish some level of normalcy in the gateway to the Deep South City. On Sunday, September the 13th, John Marshall of the 97th Ohio will write, "The sun comes out beautiful and bright. Universal quiet reigns throughout camp. The ringing of church bells sounds with delight upon our ears. How home-like it seems to be once more in a place where both sexes are seen going to the place of worship. Many of the boys attend church in town." Just a week later, any real hope of Chattanooga remaining home-like for long is shattered. The Battle of Chickamauga unfolds just a dozen miles to the south of the city. At first, it was the sound of battle to the south. Then the slight increase in the now new normal volume of army wagon traffic on the streets. And then a few wounded. But on September the 20th, a flood. Marshall, part of the garrison of the town, will write about that Sunday, September the 20th. Everything is astir and preparations are being made to receive the wounded. Soon the long lines of ambulances begin to make their appearance. At the same time, immense wagon trains are moving to the rear, and not only to the rear, but across the river. Soon the incessant roar of artillery begins. The bridge across the river having but one track, the crossing is very slow, and soon the streets are filled with teams and wagons. The firing continues and is either growing nearer or heavier. Soon rumors begin to come in that our troops are giving way. Not being able to learn anything in camp, I ride uptown about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Here all is uncertainty, but enough is seen to make us fear the worst. Here we meet the 5th Regular Battery, entirely disabled, having lost more than half their complement of men and horses. Here another ambulance train loaded with wounded. Here a squad of stragglers. Ask them of the battle. They say the day is lost and our forces are fleeing before the enemy. Here we meet some wounded, crawling along as it were. Ask them, and they say the battle was tremendous and that some portions of our forces were compelled to give way before the superior force of the enemy, but that the day is not lost. How different from the language of those who so willfully deserted their brethren in the time of danger. Ride out further towards the front, but fail to find anything positive, the roads being almost blocked up with teams, ambulances, and wounded. This flood of Union soldiers and injured come on to Chattanooga from the Union defeat at Chickamauga. In that battle, about 6,000 Union soldiers will be wounded, and about 4,000 of them initially come into town. And now Moses' preparations are quickly consumed, and a dramatic expansion is needed. Buildings are seized, and a series of general hospitals are established. General Hospital number 1 is created out of the 13 Confederate-built buildings south of the Academy on the southern shoulder of Cameron Hill, and is fitted out to handle about 1,000 patients. Hospital number 2 is another Confederate-built structure closer to the railroad depot. General Hospital number 3 is organized in the Crutchfield House, 500 beds, or 500 patients, men on both beds and the floors. The Baptist Church, which appears in this photograph, you can see the church there, and a little bit closer, although the photo gets a little grainier. The Christian Commission is forced to give up its use of the Baptist Church at the time. And that church is fitted up to handle about 200 injured, or that and 2 other churches are fitted up to handle about 200 injured soldiers as General Hospital number 4. In the Presbyterian Church, Thomas Macaulay will write, during the terrible Monday when everything was in confusion, our church edifice on Market Street was taken for a hospital, and the pews were torn out, cots were placed, and were soon filled with wounded soldiers from the Chickamauga battlefield. The lofts over buildings occupied as commissary warehouses along Market and Broad Street are seized and used for about 300 patients. And 400 in another series of buildings. The Academy on the southern portion of Cameron Hill becomes Officers' Hospital number 1 for 100 wounded Union officers. And several large private mansions and other homes are taken possession of as well, for another almost 200 to 250 patients. Overall, Moses is able to accommodate about 3,000 of the wounded. Some of the more slightly wounded are receiving care still with their units as those units take position around town. That same night of September the 20th, Moses will say, all the severe cases were dressed the same night they arrived, and others the next day, and all received food, of which many have been deprived for 2 days. Wounded still continue to come in on the 21st, but with Chattanooga now the position of the Union Army of the Cumberland, and the Army beginning to construct the line of fortifications around the east and south side of the city. line of fortifications around the east and south side of the city. Most famously, a widely recognized Fort Wood, the Fort Wood neighborhood here, as they begin to build those fortifications. Efforts began on the 21st to evacuate as many of the wounded as possible to places of greater safety, with a higher percentage of slightly wounded than in other battles, because the Battle of Chickamauga had been fought in a wooded or forested environment, and many projectiles had struck a tree or a branch or a limb and lost much of their power before striking the human form. There were more soldiers who were only lightly injured, as opposed to, say, the Battle of Stones River 9 months before. Those who can still walk are immediately started westward towards Bridgeport and Stevenson, Alabama. Some along the main route past the tip of Lookout Mountain and then westward through Running Water Creek Ravine and on out to Bridgeport, but many are started over Walden's Ridge along either the Anderson Road or along the Sut Creek Road and the Haley's Trace Road. They intend of moving them to Bridgeport and Stevenson, where they can be cared for and hospitals being established there, or where they can get rail transportation to Murfreesboro, Nashville, or even as far away as Louisville. And as this effort to evacuate patients begins, a location is sought north of the river, where elements of the division hospitals could be positioned and co-located with one another to essentially create a large tent-based general hospital. And the site selected is Stringer Spring in the southern end of Red Bank. And in that immediate area, on September the 21st and 22nd, is established this large cluster of 10th Union hospitals, and by the 23rd, not more than 800 of those 4,000 wounded who had come into Chattanooga remain in Chattanooga. Though between those who have been started westward and those who have been moved to Stringer Spring, only 800 of the gravest cases actually remained in town. And over the next week, many of them will also be moved to Stringers as their condition improves enough that they can bear the transportation that distance. In town, other elements of the hospitals of the various Union divisions are assigned space, including space in some of the churches in town, reducing Surgeon Moses's general hospitals to just number 1, the Confederate buildings on the southern shoulder of Cameron Hill, number 3, the Crutchfield House, and the Officers' Hospital in the Masonic Academy. And in fact, by late October, the Christian Commission is able to once again reoccupy the Baptist Church and begin conducting their services within the walls of that church. While the tsunami of Chickamauga wounded swept through and over Chattanooga itself relatively quickly, Chattanooga had still become the frontline position of the United States battle for the gateway to the Deep South. And it was clear that very likely in the not-too-distant future that there would be another big battle, and the grind of war was and would be taking its hold still more firmly. And caught up in that were Chattanooga's churches, as hospitals, if at least only temporarily, were on standby to be such again, and eventually, as was the case for the brick St. Paul's and Cumberland Presbyterian churches next door to one another, to become magazines for the storage of some of the munitions of war themselves, their spiritual provinces for a time essentially forced into hiatus, while the people of the nation, largely believing that they were doing God's work, seemingly paid greater homage to the gods of war than the Prince of Peace. Jim, I think we...
Whoa! And you never took us up Missionary Ridge. Yeah. We're still hanging.
It's only the 23rd of October.